All right, welcome everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces and a lot of new ones. So welcome to the session on global trends and the 2024 strategy for the OpenID Foundation. We have with us three of the Foundation's illustrious board members. So I will ask them briefly to introduce themselves. Nancy, would you like to say a few words? Hello?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me, first of all? Yes? Wow, that's great. Nancy Kamwinjit, I am a Cisco fellow. I do lots of security-based things at Cisco, but most importantly, I focus on identity as one of the things that I do. And as a member here, I am most interested in the shared signals and how we can improve the sharing of knowledge, if you will, to improve the threat efficacy that's out.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Nat.
So I'm Nat Sakimura, the chairman of the OpenID Foundation. Together, we started writing OpenID Connect that you probably know. Also, in the recent years, I've been working on FAPI, something called FAPI, which is the higher security profile of an OpenID Connect.
Okay. We might talk about it. We might talk about both of those. And John.
John Bradley. I've been on the board a long time. This is the T-shirt from Identiverse 11 years ago, where we declared SAML dead and the rise of OpenID Connect. That didn't quite play out overnight like we had potentially imagined, but the trend continues. There's changes going forward. I'm one of the authors of the WebAuthn and FIDO standards and involved in federation for research and education using an updated OpenID Connect federation protocol, which we can get into later. So I'm still involved in a large number of the Connect standards, moving towards verifiable credentials.
Great. Thank you, John. And I'm Gail Hodges, the executive director of the OpenID Foundation. So I'm going to give a... So today's session, we're just going to talk very briefly about what is the OpenID Foundation. Then we're going to talk about 5 of the top trends that we're seeing from our vantage point on the board. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So we'll welcome you along for the ride. So first off, many of you will have seen this slide before if you're familiar with the OpenID Foundation. Our vision is to help people assert their identity wherever they choose and to lead the global community in creating standards that are secure, interoperable, and privacy-preserving. And there's a couple of things I'll call out on there. One is that it's trying to be people-focused, right? So it's not just about supporting our direct members that are implementing our standards, but really making sure that the people are in the center of what we do, and playing our role to have a leading voice in the global community and helping to bring the community together. And that'll come into our conversation later today. Our standards, which were written by some of the folks on our stage, have been used by billions of users across millions of applications. We're most well known for login and for single sign-on use cases for users and for consumers and for enterprise. But also in the open banking, open data, open health, digital identity, and shared signal space. We work very closely with a bunch of government partners, which is going to come up as we go through the presentation today. And we have a lot of very smart people that we're fortunate to have on our board to give us direction as an organization. We're going to give a couple of definitions for context today. So I'll run through these real quick. So conduit, and we can thank Mark Hain in the back for these definitions of conduit and payload. So if we don't like them, you get to beat up Mark. So conduit is a communication protocol that provides security and interoperability when passing a payload between the parties, and a payload, a formatted information that is sent through the conduit also contributes to interoperability. And then for digital identity, I'll let you read that one yourself, but we're using the one from the OECD. And I also have borrowed from Don Cardinal at FDX the lovely truck that he offered that I could use in a presentation back in the day. So you'll see his beautiful truck. Some of you might have seen that before, of the standardized payload and the Rails. So in the standards that we have, some of them are just one component and others are both components. So we'll flag those as we go through the presentation today. Okay. All right. So this is where Gail gets to have a little bit of fun and, abuse the stage. Our first trend, I'm likening to the family of meerkats here on the stage. So I enjoy watching lots of nature programming, and meerkats are very well known for their signaling. When dangers come, then they all help each other to look out for signals of danger. And this is my introduction to Nancy's section on shared signals, whether she might begrudgingly give me that liberty or not, in how the standard of shared signals might relate to meerkats. So I've had my fun. Now, Nancy, over to you.
Well, I think we're eating off the fact that I'm very security-oriented, and meerkats, when there's a warning. But the endeavor of the shared, so how many of you are familiar with the shared signals framework? I do. Okay, you guys don't count the ones that are offering the shared signals group, but basically it's that fabric and the interconnect with some of the standards in the IETF that give you the conduits, if you will, and some of the messaging for how you can carry signals. What we took on in the OpenID Foundation is how do we do this to improve the efficacy of the authentication sessions, if you will, as they happen through. That was the beginning of the journey, but we know that we need to move it further on. This is to say, now more than ever, and again, my security hat will come on very strong, those threats are very real, not just because we've got everything flowing through the internet. We now have AI to thank for this as well. And so this is where it becomes very critical and very important for us to be able to share information. The two schemes that we've currently started on is about the logins and the credentials, the identity-based schemas, if you will, information that we can share within there. So when we started the foundation, when we started the working group, it was a couple of years ago. It started from a blog by a tool, whom I don't see here, Beyond Corp, Google. But it was the notion of we really need to share the information. We need to do it as a community. So OpenID Foundation, perfect place to land on this. Since then, Cisco, we've joined. We're very much involved in it. We did a reference implementation. That's part of the reference guide that is in the OpenID Foundation website. Also, in looking at what we do towards the future, the NSA and CISA and NIST have also put in reports the importance of how we need to do and how we need to take the approach of sharing this information. So the other thing that we're doing is we need to gain that broader adoption. We need to get our customers, our enterprises, out also leveraging not just from a threat perspective, but also to give you that improved visibility. So while I'm speaking to it from a security perspective, dang, I hoped I wouldn't have to use this. Is this any better? Yeah. Okay. So this is just to say we are also starting a white paper on this very topic, just to give you the notion and a better understanding and education of the things that we can achieve, again, improved visibility and threat protection, if you will, through the shared signals. So Sean will be taking some interviews, so don't be surprised if he may approach your company to gain more of that information and provide some of those results. So with that, stop.
Yep. Sounds good. I might add to that briefly that some of you that are following the digital identity or digital credentials work, the DCP working group, there's some effort to look at how one could use the shared signals framework and add in lifecycle management for digital credentials as another category beyond the accounts and the sessions as two other categories. So that's an area that Oliver Terbu has been exploring, and I think there's a lot of interest to see if we can push that further in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned, we've started with the two schemas. So the framework really is a framework. The two schemas that are in existence is one that goes towards the credentials. The other one goes towards managing the sessions. The third one is the provisioning lifecycle of verifiable credentials. In the IETF, we also have another profile for I'll say the classical provisioning, if you're familiar with SCIM. and how those signals could be carried through the SSF.
Yeah.
So
Perfect.
thanks. Yep.
Yeah. Great. So I think we were seeing a lot of really interesting traction. There was the Gartner Interop event in March. We have another. We're looking likely to do another one in December. So cross fingers that all comes together.
And Japan has also shown interest,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
in getting
absolutely.
adoption. So through interop testing. Yep.
Right. So if anything there flags your interest, keep a lookout for the CAPE session. There'll be a panel on CAPE later this week.
Later this week.
Exactly. Tomorrow. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, that's our first trend. Okay, we've made it through 20% there. Next one, I'm having fun again. This time I was channeling how do I represent open banking and open data in a fun way, and this is what you get. You get London and the 1800s and all of the different train lines. I used to live in London for 10 years, so I'm intimately familiar with how difficult it is to get between these various train stations. Maybe some of you have been caught trying to get across town as well. They're all scattered around because they used to have different owners for each of the different train lines. And then voila, along came the Circle Line in order to connect most of those stations together. And that was their way of trying to solve for a level of interoperability between the train stations. So that is my analogy for the next section, which I'll tap Nat on here, around open banking and open data, and what we're seeing around the desire, sometimes from regulators, sometimes led by the private sector itself, to link up and to empower users to be able to ask for their data and to give consent-based release of their data from their financial institution or from other data sources and share it with fintechs or share it with other banks or share it with other relying parties. And then we also, in this context, we offer the conduit of FAPI. So from there, Nat, maybe you can share a bit more.
Yeah, so this travel started back in 2015, 2016 or something like that, when the notion of open banking actually came along. And at the time, in the beginning, we thought, okay, we can just use OAuth. Wrong. There are so many options which are so insecure, right? So we quickly found out that we actually have to boil it down to the options that are secure enough, also interoperable enough, that all the fintechs, thousands of fintechs and thousands of banks can actually interoperate, and that's how FAPI came around. When we first started FAPI, we thought we are going to do both the conduit and the payload, but we quickly found out that payload is too hard to tackle on the global level, so we concentrated on the conduit, that's connection layer. And the FAPI working group's been doing that all the time since it's now 8 years, a lot of time. And we've provided FAPI 1.0 3-4 years ago, and now we are almost finishing FAPI 2.0. And can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So these FAPI standards has been adopted pretty well worldwide, starting from the UK, Australia, Brazil, Middle East, and other places. That it's doing billions of transactions a year. So which has been used and battle tested pretty well. And we are seeing some movement here in North America, right? In the United States and Canada. And perhaps Gail can talk more about the situations in the United States. But that's where we are right now.
Yeah, maybe before we go on to the next page, I'll just make a brief mention. Some of you might have caught that we shared an open letter with the CFPB director, Chopra, about a week and a half ago in order to try and provide some timely feedback on our recommendations to have a communications protocol specifically called out as a qualified industry standard, separate to the payload content or the data components. And so we provided what we hoped to be a very thoughtful letter, and also one that articulated the risks of not naming such a communications protocol, so that they could reflect carefully on the consequences of not moving down that path, because it could undermine their intentions if people go down an OAuth route and it ends up taking them somewhere that is not ultimately interoperable and serving the objectives of the CFPB. So we look forward to further discussions with the CFPB and the director, and certainly with any of you if you have questions around that open letter.
Yeah. So important thing is that just saying OAuth doesn't cut. Right? It's not going to be interoperable or secure enough.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Exactly. And then the future, Nat.
All right. So this is the fun part. Those ecosystems are working within the ecosystems.
So
Right.
on the left-hand side, I'll give the context. So on the left-hand side of our page is where we have many of the countries that have already selected the FAPI protocol. So they'd be on a trajectory that would make it easier for them to interoperate cross borders for open banking and open data. Doesn't really exist yet, but there's an area of interest, and we wrote a white paper about it last year by Dima Pozmakov that was based on many technical experts discussing how it might be possible to achieve that. The top right-hand corner has some of the other implementations that somewhat predate FAPI, and which took a different path, that are not using the same protocol, but are also enabling open banking or open data implementations. And then on the bottom right are many of the multinational organizations that are advocating for open banking and open data, and that cascading. So you might not see things like a World Bank report on open banking and open data, but it is indeed there, and it is something that's recommended to countries in the global south, not just in the global north. So it's happening everywhere, and this desire for interoperability is bubbling up in places like the Bank of International Settlements, BIS, which is controlled by the central banks around the world. So sorry, that was the background for that slide, Nat, to remind you.
Yeah. So you've talked pretty much everything, but so these ecosystems are working primarily right now, working within themselves, but to do the crossover or cross-border thing, we have to come up with other things like how to come up with a trustworthy, we call it trust list, the list of the keys of the trusted parties and things like that as well. And also, we have to agree on the minimum viable payloads, right? I mean, even simply saying name actually doesn't really work. So that kind of things has to be really sorted out. So there are lots of things to be done.
Yeah.
But we're getting there with the City Hub and other efforts, which I think Gail is going to talk about a little bit
Yeah,
later.
I think I'll do that next, yeah. Or, sorry, in a bit. So a huge amount going on here, right? A lot of global adoption, a lot of movement, very, very active space. So if you're not directly in the sphere of finance, you might not know about all of this momentum that's going on right now. Okay, the next one, and I'm ready for John to rip up my slide into small little pieces, with his dissatisfaction with both the words and the pictures. So talking about the two different dimensions of digital identity around centralized identity ecosystems and decentralized identity ecosystems is our third trend. And then we're going to double down on the decentralized approach and what the EU model is. I'll go to you now and take my bullets.
I'll try and overcome my deep, heartfelt hurt at not having a cute intro slide. But I'm cute enough. So I'm probably going to move around a bit. So a lot of people think of the original OpenID Connect and SAML sort of framework as being centralized. When we moved from SAML to OpenID Connect, we added a number of features that a lot of people said, are you crazy? Nobody will ever want to use that, such as PSYOP, which was a wallet format, such as distributed credentials, which was a way of aggregating claims from multiple claims providers, now called issuers, originally through the user info endpoint, so that if you wanted to get claims from a bunch of places, OpenID Connect in the traditional centralized model would allow you to go to the user info endpoint, and if there were claims that you were asking for that were actually, say, belong to DMV, you could get back a access token and a pointer to go get those claims from that third party. So we had a lot of these concepts, 10, 11 years ago when we did OpenID Connect, when Nat and I sort of first sketched it out. What's happened is that there's more focus on privacy now. So we've moved from, so this centralized model I would describe as a two-party federation, that you have an identity provider and a relying party, and the third party was the attribute provider, which could have been decentralized, but people describe it still as a two-party federation model. Now we've moved to the credential, what is decentralized? It's a marketing term, so I intensely dislike it. Everybody wants to sell you something that's decentralized, though if they can sell it, is it really decentralized?
No, don't say that.
I have an AI blockchain thing that I can hook you up with at a very reasonable price. So in the three-party model, we have a relying party, a user, and an issuer. So this sort of formalizes the sort of distributed claims provider that we had in OpenID Connect, which is why for the European digital wallets for ISO driver's licenses, online presentment kind of naturally follows some of the OpenID Connect sort of rails. So what we've done is moved the IDP essentially to the wallet. And the things that were the distributed claims providers are now verifiable credential issuers. So what we've done is created a huge problem for ourselves. And we don't necessarily realize it yet. So people will tell you that my worldview is that all problems are essentially key management problems. My wife will violently disagree with my hypothesis, but that's another question. So now the signing key for doing the presentment no longer lives in at the IDP, where they have some super expensive HSM that they're protecting all of these keys. We now have 100,000 times more keys. We now have them living in potentially less secure places. So when this guy goes to, creates a credential that needs to be bound to a private key that only exists on the wallet, we have trust relationships, now more complicated trust relationships. How does the issuer trust a wallet? Does every issuer have their own wallet? We'd like to avoid that. How do relying parties trust issuers? What is the invocation protocol when we don't want relying parties to know what wallets the person has. So if I have a Uruguayan national ID wallet, if the RP can tell that without me actually giving some sort of consent, then I've disclosed that I'm probably from Uruguay, or could be Estonia, could be any place. So if you have a state-issued driver's license, again, if you have a state-issued wallet, potentially you're leaking information. So we are working with W3C on standards to try and abstract that, but that also creates additional problems with how do the various parties trust each other. I can't, as a relying party, one of the ideas in Europe is I'll get a special European certificate that I'll put on my website so that all the European issuers will trust the European, it's called a QWAC, special certificate. Well, but if I have to put a special European certificate on my website, how does that going to work with a California driver's license? Yes, it might work with that. So we have to figure out how to, encoding the trust relationships at the TLS layer may not be ideal, may not scale. So when the individual people who are working on these problems look at my little solution, I'm AMVA, all I have to do is worry about the US states and maybe Canada and the Caribbean. They're not necessarily designing things that are globally interoperable, and OpenID Foundation is trying to look at things like Connect Federation, where we can better map these trust relationships, outside of the TLS layer and the lower bits of the protocol. So we're looking at, we have OpenID for, I think we have another slide that shows some of the protocol stuff. Yeah, so we have OpenID for verifiable presentation, which is, what happens is that the wallet goes and talks to an issuer for issuance under the OpenID for verifiable credential issuance, and you get a whole bunch of verifiable credentials. You can only, to prevent verifier to verifier correlation, you have to present different ones to different relying parties. So these are single-use things. There are people that want to make them multiple-use things, but without zero-knowledge proofs, which we can talk about someplace else, sometime else. Using conventional cryptography, they're effectively to get the privacy benefits, they have to be single-use. So you get a verifiable credential that has a public key in it. The relying party makes a request using the verifiable presentations, or I mentioned SIOP before. If it's just the pseudonymous credential, we have that as well in OpenID Connect, and that is being specified by the EU, etc., as one of the credential formats they want. But the wallet takes the verifiable credential, signs over it with its private key, turns it into a verifiable presentation, and that goes back. But these rails are sort of format independent, so we may have SDJOT as a container format. We may have ISO MDoc. We may have W3C verifiable credential format if you're in RDF, if you roll with RDF. So we're trying to keep it, the different layers separate. So there's, what goes into the credential, which may be defined by ISO, but ISO supports both SDJOTs and MDocs. So you have what the information is, then you have how it's blinded, which is the format of the container, and then the rails that actually allow people to make requests and get responses. So this is all very similar to what people are used to with OpenID Connect. We've just kind of shuffled the roles around. So now the IDP is the thing that the person has in their browser or mobile device or downloaded as a progressive web app.
So a lot to take in.
Have I used too much time yet?
You got through the architectural reference framework in a few minutes, so that's, I think, pretty good. Pretty good going. Most people would be challenged to do that. So a good overview, and we can take some questions later on that. I think we probably, in the interest of time, we'll speed on to the next couple of trends, and then we'll come back to any questions they have for you, John. I will go on.
Who's next?
I get to be next. I know, privilege of the mic.
Okay,
I'll just hold on to it. Hold on to it for a second.
That's dangerous, man.
Great. So John pointed out that there's challenge. He mentioned the U.S. having a particular mode where it's focused on the mobile driving licenses in most jurisdictions, where California has been an exception, which looks more like the architectural reference framework in the EU. And then there's many other countries that are also deploying digital identity. So here in North America, you might not be aware that there are millions of people in Nigeria with digital identity credentials, that there's Ethiopians with digital identity credentials. There are actually tens of implementations around the world of digital identity already, and none of them, outside of the mobile driving licenses and the European context, they're not interoperable with each other. They're not interoperable by default because of these differences in the the standards. And even if you have the same standard, you could have variances in the profile, which limits its interoperability. So we've got this billion plus. ADHAR is the largest part of that billion, of course. So we have this, going into the billions of credential users, and they're not interoperable, but they probably should be, right? The way I think about it is that you have your email, you have a phone number, and you expect the email or their phone number just to get to that other person on the other side of the world. There should be a similar level of ease with which you as an individual can assert your identity to another individual or another entity in another jurisdiction, and there you should be able to exchange, right? So here we are. We did a paper last year co-branded with 13 different nonprofit organizations, including UNHCR, to look at human-centric digital identity and to map some of those different digital identity implementations. And you probably can't see in the back of the room the grid, but it puts it on a spectrum of centralized models versus decentralized models, whether we like it or not, John. That's the idea. And then public-led with government-led implementations or private-led, so private sector-funded implementations like a bank ID in Norway. So you have these different dispositions, and it's unlikely that that's magically going to change, and the way the values and the orientations of a jurisdiction is going to change. Like the UK is very much going down a path where it's going to empower private sector implementations of digital identity and not to have a national identity credential. That's obviously very different to what Nigeria is doing with its NIMC credential, where it's a more centralized model. So we're already on a path where we're not starting out in a place of convergence. We're simply not in the same place. But we would want to be able to get to interoperability ultimately. So how do we go about doing that? We are not really sure yet, but we got together a whole bunch of people last November at an event called the Sustainable and Interoperable Digital Identity Hub, and met together in Paris with a bunch of bright people to say, do we think we have a real problem? And we had 25 standards bodies and nonprofits and countries taking part. And we said, do we need to define this? Do we need to work on how we do interoperability? And the loud consensus was yes. In our exit poll, 92% of the attendees said, yes, we needed to continue this work into this year. And so we did. We started setting up these 5 different work streams in order to unpack this problem in a very kind of community-based way, with champion use, trying to identify champion use cases, identify minimum requirements for interoperability, to do formal kind of trust framework mapping between different jurisdictions, to set metrics of success and KPIs for ourselves, and to look at what governance would be required within City Hub, and maybe also outside of this work of City Hub as well, right? Are we going to be able to use current institutions to do things like issuer discovery across a range of different issuers, public and private? Are we going to be able to use existing capabilities to identify relying parties? Like you were saying, this EU ECOWA thing on a website sounds really clumsy to me. QHAC. So we had a second City Hub just 10 days ago. I'm recovering from a cold from getting back from there. So just last Monday. And we got together another group from Africa, along with many of the development partners, to continue that dialogue. And that is our first of what will be 5 summits this year to continue this conversation, culminating in the G20 later this year. And if you're interested in learning more about City Hub, we'll have a panel on it. Mark Hain, myself, and Nick Mothershaw will share what's happening with the City Hub initiative, and we warmly welcome involvement in that. But that is a trend, right? This concept that it's not going to magically solve itself, that we won't get to interoperability of digital identity unless those of us with expertise in identity are taking part in the solution. I like to give the analogy that no one's coming in on a white horse to save us all and solve the problem of interoperability, so we have to do it ourselves. All right, we've made it down to the number 1 trend, and this time it's a waterfall. Now, what on earth am I doing this time? This time it's convergence. This is the convergence of waterfall streams. I don't know, where's my mind? So in this one, what we see from our vantage point is that there's a general convergence of these 3 trends around digital identity, open finance and data, and faster payments. And what you see with the flags on the screen are just some of the countries that we work with directly as the OpenID Foundation. It's by no means representative of all the countries that are actively working on each of these domain spaces. But it's a useful kind of representation of how there's starting to be some convergence to the center. If you look at Brazil, their work on PICs for faster payments, their digital identity work, all this gov.br work that they have in Brazil is gained incredible traction and incredible reach, and is probably I don't know if it's actually catching up on Aadhaar in terms of like number of uses. It's really quite remarkable in its scale. So Brazil has already brought those three areas together in its last couple of years of deployment. And then you have other places like here in the US, we have digital identity work going on with our states, with mobile driving licenses and some other efforts. And then you have open banking and open data under the rulemaking of the CFPB and the other work at FDX, kind of in a kind of very separate domain space. But they're both happening all at the same time. So we think we're going to continue to see that convergence. Other jurisdictions like Australia are pointing in towards that. So I'm now going to open it up with one more point before I hand it back to my panel, our panel, which is to say there's another global trend of digital public infrastructure. You might have heard that in the G20 context raised, and it might be hard to know what is actually unpacked within the term digital public infrastructure. And lo and behold, it's a lot of the same things in the prior page, plus one extra. So it's digital identity, open finance, open data, faster payments, and digital government services. And as the OpenID Foundation, we're, again, seeing all of this because our standards are commonly used by governments and private sector implementers supporting those initiatives. So with that, I wanted to open it back up to the panel and see if who would like to jump in and comment on this trend. Also civilized all of a sudden.
So I certainly see a lot of this in Europe, where there are currently 4 large-scale pilots underway, DC4U in research and education, potential doing something, and EWC and NoBid. So they each have are looking at where the national ID, once there is an interoperable, it's called a PID, national ID document. Once there is that, how does that then get used by the private sector? What are the different use cases in DC4U? With my research and education hat on, we're looking at, how does this play into your transcripts, electronic student IDs, being able to get your food at the commissary. There's all sorts of uses for these sorts of credentials and wallets. Certainly in South America, where I'm from, in Chile, they're part of the financial regulators look at OpenID Connect is also expanding it into, outside of North America, many countries, everybody has a national ID and they use it for everything. In fact, my Supermercado points are my national ID number and my frequent flyer airline number and all of that. So the national ID, in fact, you used to have to write your national ID number on your Visa receipt so that it was official, because it was illegal to lie about what your national ID number was. So you didn't sign it, you had to write down your national ID number. That's how obsessive some countries are. But they, for better or worse, because people are used to doing everything with national IDs, how a FAPI-backed ID verification system that meets the KYC requirements, how can that then fit into all of these other use cases? So there is a once you have a sufficient infrastructure, there's a lot of cases where people are trying to converge it. Chile actually has something called Clave Única, which is an OpenID Connect national ID federation, except that nobody in their right mind actually trusts the civil registry in Chile, so the banks won't use it. It's not that the OpenID Connect is at fault. There's other issues.
Did you want to go?
No.
So I'll elaborate a little bit on some of the movement I'm seeing in the U.S. So if you're in California, I think you alluded, Gail, to the California driver's license. I actually was able to use it here once as my proof of identity, believe it or not. So this is to say there's a dozen or so states already doing issuance, so you might check wherever state you might be in if you can get a digital driver's license. I know that in Arizona, for instance, they're starting to expose more of that leveraging, but as they're still building that government infrastructure, it's all within the state. So your Arizona driver's license is tied into the TSA, for instance, as well as some other government services. From an industry perspective, we're starting to look at how we can tie in to, it's interesting, Nat and I, while you were talking, John, we were saying, it's kind of like PKI, only different, right? At the end of the day, it is a key management problem. As we evolve things, we're now in a hyper-distributed key management problem, right? We've effectively pushed the problem down to allowing anybody to be a credential issuer, but now you have that many-to-many trust relationship, and that's the thing that we're trying to grapple with. So I agree with John, sorry, Gail, not quite a decentralized identity, but pushing the problem further down. So this is to say that from an industry perspective, that brings a lot of potential disruption in how now we can go towards that path of convergence of why couldn't I use, if I were to think of, now don't beat me up, if I were to think of a government-issued ID akin to my root of trust, as an example, I could be using it for any of my other applications access, right? So those are the kinds of things that as an industry we're starting to look at how, as we unfold the protocols, how can we begin to establish that level of scale in that key management problem. Okay, I'll mention the PQC, post-quantum stuff, because that will have to come in the next few years. So doing all of that key management in a secure way with some future-proofing, knowing that post-quantum is coming to life. But anyway, these are all things that as an industry, we're seeing that potential and being proactive in making sure that we have a level of infrastructure in place to make it more, I'll say, frictionless to you, the user.
Right, Nat, any comments before I go on to the Q&A?
Maybe I just want to touch on some of the human factors as well. So when you were using the mobile driver's license or something like that, how was it verified?
Verified for issuance, you mean?
I mean, how did the verifier verify it?
Yeah. So, okay, I cheated. It was a manual verification. So in one instance, I just showed my phone that had my driver's license, and they did the manual face. The other one was interesting. They did an age verification. So was going through an application, I forget what I was trying to purchase or register for, and they needed to know my age. And it just, like magic happened. A minute later, it came back and said, okay, you've been verified.
Yep.
So there's some work starting.
Yeah, the thing is that for almost every Japanese, we have national identity card with a PKI X509 certificate in it, and you can always verify the veracity of it using the electronic signature or something like that. But what happens usually is that people look at the face of the card and say, okay, that's good, right? Which is kind of easy to fake. So, in the coming digital ages, we also have to change the way people expect and the way people act. And that's a very important human factor, I think.
I think we got to take maybe a question or
So
two
just
before we close.
quickly, on human factors, we also have to think about whether or not we're encouraging people to overshare. Logging in with all of your attributes to every website is a potential danger, as people, we're essentially giving people bigger guns to shoot themselves in the foot with, and we have to properly educate them as to what the potential consequences are and give them tools to perhaps say, you probably shouldn't be sharing all of your driver's license and or bank account information with some random website to look at pictures of kittens. So we are moving into a place where people had sort of self-asserted stuff like sharing your Gmail address was sort of one level of risk, but now people will have the ability to share sensitive PII, which, in Singapore they've had problems with people's life savings being emptied out of their accounts because they scanned QR codes with the Singapore National ID app to win a contest, and it allowed somebody to take all of their Social Security savings. So we have to look at what we're teaching people to do and make sure that we have appropriate risk mitigations in place.
Good. All right, let's take a couple of questions, see if we have any questions in the room on the themes we raised today or on any of the other things going on in the foundation. We can see what questions you have for our victims on the stage. Question here? Might need to yell it out. I'm not sure we have any walking mics.
You're first.
Oh, very nimble.
Thank you. Much appreciated. On the slide with the grid showing the different governments, I saw the U.S. on there for both public and private. Is that a difference at the state versus federal level? Things like ID.me versus state issuers?
It's probably, I can't remember.
There it is.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that one.
I think that's probably the case.
And accordingly, do you see any other countries where you're going to see that kind of mix?
Anything is possible.
Okay.
Right? I mean, here in the U.S., clearly we tend not to favor regulation, right? So we're likely to see more complexity here in the U.S. continue. In a lot of jurisdictions, they have no qualms about having centralized approaches, right? So that tends to be the norm. But yes, we're seeing everything, every flavor at the moment. Yeah, next question.
Hi there, Gareth Narayan Singh from the Open Identity Exchange. I'm going to ask a really unkind question, and I apologise for that because I'm a big fan of the OIDF and the work that you do, and you have a very esteemed board. But I represent the OIX, which is a membership community of 70 companies operating in and around digital identity. 90 to 95% of them probably won't understand the technical concepts which are being explained today. What is the plan for OIDF to bring these concepts outside of this room to the world where commercial revenue is the imperative and there's a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders? So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the great stuff that's been discussed, but actually the stuff that commercial enterprises are currently engaged with.
Do you want me to start? Any of you want to go? So I'll start by saying the OIX is a great partner organization of long standing, as I think you know. So many efforts were in partnership on, like the GAIN effort, the GAIN proof of concept, the interoperability group that they've been hosting, and most recently the City Hub effort. So we try and stay in lockstep with them as partners on the rules, whereas we're doing the tools on the technical side. So we do need to stay in sync. I know in the City Hub conversation we'll get into that, like what do we need to do more holistically to create a playbook that would help jurisdictions, help implementers to scale, because it's much more than just the standards. It's much more than just the policy piece. It's much more than just open source code. You need a combination of different factors in order to have a playbook that others can follow. And it can sometimes feel like simplistic that, if you just have this open source wallet, this will solve everything. Or if you just have this set of rules and this policy, it's going to fix everything. And it's not that easy. right? So yes, I think we do take it on as a burden of the board, no longer just to focus on the specifications themselves and what those need, but like actually how are they situated within context, like within the ecosystems, and how do we make sure that they can interoperate, have the security benefits, and so forth. So I think we see that obligation goes a little bit further. That's my view. You guys want to add in?
Okay, hi. My name is Stian from BankID Norway, and I have a question for Nat concerning FAPI2. Because you mentioned that the payload is something you kept out of scope. Are you then referring to the integrity of the payload in that? Because that's at least one thing I've been thinking about that's missing from the current draft, at least last time I read it.
So integrity of the payload itself is there. We are not talking about, we are making the actual content of the payload out of scope. So the schema out of scope. The entire thing is signed, so the integrity is there.
That's the integrity of the depot. The connection from the depot to the content of the message is not there, is it?
It's using request object. As long as you use request object, that is integrity protected.
You might want to take this one offline, because I think we've just run out of time. I'm seeing the sign in the back of the room. So apologies for that. And for anyone who didn't get a chance to raise their questions, please, you can try and grab us. But thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.